The radio crackled at 1:30 in the morning on April 19th, 1989, breaking the quiet with a frantic call about a body found deep in the shadows of the park. Police officers rushed into the cold spring night, their flashlights cutting through the dark trees until they stopped on a horrific scene. A young woman lay in the mud, brutally attacked and left to die alone. Her injuries were so severe that the first officers could barely comprehend the violence. An unsettling dread washed over the detectives as they stared into the dark woods. The victim was barely breathing, and the unknown attacker was long gone. There were no immediate clues left behind, only the chilling reality of a brutal crime. The shadows seemed to hide a terrible secret, setting the stage for a desperate hunt that would soon tear innocent lives apart. By sunrise, a shockwave of pure fear gripped the entire city. The young woman was fighting for her life, and the public was absolutely terrified. People looked over their shoulders, wondering what kind of monster could do such a thing. The newspapers screamed for answers, creating a heavy panic that demanded someone pay for the terrible pain inflicted. This intense fear placed a crushing weight on the police department, creating a chilling pressure that warped the investigation. The terrified public demanded a quick capture. Detectives felt the heat of millions of angry eyes watching them, pushing them to find a target before the sun set again. The demand for blood drowned out the careful work of real police science. Unpacking the police response reveals a sweeping dragnet that completely ignored standard rules of evidence. Instead of looking for physical clues, officers flooded the area and started rounding up Black and Latino teenagers who happened to be nearby. They cast a massive net, throwing kids into police cruisers without a single shred of proof connecting them to the crime. This unsettling reality showed a system acting entirely on deep racial bias rather than actual facts. The police looked at these young boys and immediately saw suspects. The officers did not stop to ask if these kids had any motive, because the color of their skin was enough to make them guilty. It was a dangerous choice to blame the most vulnerable targets. Out of this massive sweep, 5 specific boys who would later become known as the Exonerated were pulled into a nightmare. Kevin Richardson, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Korey Wise were just normal kids going about their lives. Some of them were as young as 14 years old, suddenly shoved into the harsh lights of the police station. They knew nothing about the terrible violence that had happened hours earlier. The terrifying moments of their arrests happened in a blur of shouting officers and slamming doors. One minute, these boys were hanging out, and the next, they were locked in the back of moving police cars. They watched their familiar streets roll by through metal cages. These were just kids, completely unaware they were becoming the targets of a desperate investigation. The chilling consequence of this rapid sweep was immediate and total isolation. Once inside the thick walls of the police precinct, the young boys were separated and thrown into tiny, stark interrogation rooms. The heavy metal doors clicked shut, completely cutting them off from their parents. They were stripped of all support, left to sit in hard chairs under glaring lights. The profound terror of a child sitting alone in a small room cannot be overstated. They were surrounded by angry, armed adults who wore badges and towered over them with stern faces. The boys waited in silence, wondering when their parents would walk through the door. But the parents were kept outside, leaving these scared kids entirely at the mercy of desperate detectives. The mood in the tiny rooms shifted in a deeply unsettling moment when the police stopped asking what the boys saw and started yelling that they knew what they did. The questions turned into accusations, hitting the kids like physical blows. The boys tried to explain they were only witnesses to the police chasing other kids, but the men with badges only wanted a confession. A deep, sinking feeling washed over the kids as they realized the police didn't want to help them. The protective image of the friendly officer shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality that these adults viewed them as monsters. Every time a boy denied being involved, the yelling grew louder. They were trapped in a nightmare where telling the truth only made the angry men yell harder. This terrifying shift marked the beginning of a dark art practiced inside the interrogation room. The police didn't have a single drop of blood or any physical evidence tying these 5 boys to the brutal attack. Because the science gave them nothing, the detectives knew they needed words to build their case. They began a relentless mental assault, using fear and exhaustion to tear down the children. The chilling reality of this dark art is that if you yell at a child long enough and lie to them long enough, their mind will simply snap. A young brain is not built to withstand hours of screaming from powerful adults. The detectives understood this weakness perfectly, using their authority to crush the boy's spirit. It was a process designed to make the kids say whatever the police wanted. The mechanics of coerced confessions work by twisting reality until the victim feels they have no way out. Detectives look a child in the eye and lie directly to their face, claiming they have fingerprints on the victim's clothes. They build an invisible trap made of fake evidence, making the kid believe that fighting back is hopeless. The system is designed to trick the human brain, using panic to make an innocent person believe giving up is their only option. To seal the trap, the police offer a false lifeline, promising the boys they can just go home if they sign a piece of paper. They tell the exhausted kids they are not really in trouble, that they just need to help the police close the paperwork. For a terrified child who just wants their own bed, this promise is impossible to resist. The system uses a child's deep need for safety to force a desperate lie. The specific agony of these interrogations stretched on for hours upon hours in those windowless rooms. The boys were kept awake deep into the next day, deprived of sleep, denied food, and blocked from seeing their parents. Their bodies ached and their minds became foggy as the relentless yelling echoed off the walls. Detectives took turns screaming at the boys until they were willing to do anything. When the boys were finally too weak to fight back, the police began feeding them the exact details of the crime. The detectives told the kids where the victim was found and how she was hurt, forcing them to repeat the story back. The boys stumbled over words they didn't even understand, offering coerced confessions simply to make the screaming stop. They were completely unaware those forced words would lead to wrongful convictions, destroying their lives long before Matias Reyes, the real attacker, was ever found. The most heartbreaking truth of that night in the precinct is why the boys finally gave in. They did not confess because they were guilty. They said yes because they were exhausted children who just wanted to sleep in their own beds. They truly believed that agreeing with the angry detectives was the magic key to unlock the door and escape that suffocating room. In their young minds, the police were authority figures who could send them home if they just cooperated. They could not grasp the permanent weight of the documents they were signing or the statements they were repeating. It is a profound tragedy, witnessing teenagers trade their entire futures, their freedom, and their names just for a single moment of peace and the promise of a safe ride home. The result of that desperate trade was captured on camera, creating a permanent record of their defeat. In the videotaped confessions, the boys look entirely broken. They are slumped in their chairs, their eyes heavy with fatigue, looking small and defeated under the harsh precinct lights. They do not look like criminal masterminds. They look like scared kids who have been awake for over 24 hours. As they speak on camera, they constantly stumble over their words, reciting a script the police clearly taught them just moments before the recording started. They glance off camera, looking to the detectives for approval, trying to make sure they are saying the right things to earn their freedom. Those tapes, fueled by coerced confessions, became the ultimate weapon for the prosecution, effectively sealing the fate of the 5 boys before a trial even began. Outside the brick walls of the police station, a different kind of trap was being set. The very next morning, the city awoke to a media firestorm that instantly condemned the teenagers. Newspapers exploded with front-page headlines dripping with hate and anger. Reporters did not ask questions or wait for evidence. They simply printed the police narrative as absolute fact, splashing the faces of the accused across every newsstand in the city. The language used to describe these children was vicious and deliberate. The media labeled them a wolf pack, stripping away their humanity and painting them as mindless predators roaming the park. They invented and popularized the word wilding to make their actions sound like the violent behavior of savage animals. It created a dark environment where the entire city decided they were guilty monsters before a single piece of evidence was tested. Unpacking this rapid, mass condemnation reveals a deep and ugly truth about the society they lived in. The public was primed to believe the absolute worst about young Black and Latino boys. Decades of racial bias had built a narrative that equated their skin color with danger and violence. When the police presented these 5 faces to the public, it fit a story the city was already eager to accept. People were so completely blinded by fear and prejudice that they did not even care if the boys' stories made any logical sense. The deep fear of the crime in the park demanded a villain, and the public found it easier to project that anger onto marginalized teenagers than to look for the actual truth. This systemic bias acted as a heavy blindfold, allowing a false narrative to sprint forward without anyone stopping to check the facts. If anyone had actually paused to examine those videotape statements, the glaring errors would have been obvious immediately. None of the boys' stories matched each other. In a real group crime, the participants share a single reality, but these teenagers were guessing at details they had never seen. One boy said the attack happened in a specific area, while another named a completely different location in the park. The contradictions piled up with every sentence they spoke. They got the weapons wrong, describing objects that were never found at the scene. They even got the victim's clothes wrong, guessing colors and items that did not match the crime scene photos. It is a clear, step-by-step look at how the police actively ignored massive red flags, choosing to push forward with a broken story rather than admit they had the wrong suspect. While the detectives built their flawed case, the parents of the accused boys were living through an unimaginable nightmare. The devastating shock of seeing their sons paraded on television as violent criminals shattered their world. Many of these parents had actually trusted the police, believing that if they just brought their boys in to answer questions, the truth would protect them. They thought the precinct was a place of safety, only to realize the police had used their cooperation to frame their own children. The parents watched in horror as the system they taught their kids to respect actively worked to destroy their families. It is a deep, lasting betrayal, a wound that never truly heals when you realize the people sworn to protect you are the ones locking your children in cages. Despite the massive holes in the timeline and the conflicting statements, the machine of justice could not be stopped. The momentum of the media frenzy and the pressure from a panicked public demanded a quick resolution. The 5 teenagers, who would one day be known as the Exonerated Five, were now caught on a fast-moving conveyor belt, marching directly toward a courtroom that had already made up its mind. The city did not want a careful investigation. It wanted a show, and these 5 boys were forced onto the stage to play the villains. The prosecutors knew the stories were a mess, but they also knew they had the videotapes, and in a courtroom, a recorded confession is often enough to blind a jury to the truth. The stage was set for one of the most tragic legal spectacles in modern history, but before the trial even began, the prosecution received a piece of evidence that should have stopped everything. The hard science came back from the laboratory. The DNA, the hair, and the blood found at the brutal crime scene did not match any of the 5 boys. There was absolutely zero physical evidence placing any of them near the victim on that terrible night. This is where the story shifts from a tragic mistake to a deliberate injustice. The prosecutors looked directly at hard science, proving the boys were not there, and they decided to push forward anyway. They chose to ignore the biological facts, arguing that the boys simply managed to commit a horrific, messy crime without leaving a single trace of themselves behind, protecting their own narrative over the actual truth, while the real attacker, Matias Reyes, remained completely free. To understand how wrongful convictions happen even when the science screams innocence, you have to understand the deadly power of a confession in a courtroom. Nothing is more destructive than a defendant saying the words, "I did it." To a normal person sitting on a jury, it is completely impossible to understand why someone would ever confess to a terrible crime they did not commit. Juries naturally believe that self-preservation would stop anyone from lying about their own guilt. They do not see the hours of screaming, the sleep deprivation, or the false promises that happened behind closed doors. They just see a video of a person admitting to a crime. That simple, forced yes completely destroys all logic and science in the minds of the jury, turning a scared child's desperate lie into an unbreakable lock on a prison cell. The devastating weight of those forced confessions completely blinded the justice system to the actual truth, setting a dark stage for the tragedy that was about to unfold. When the first trial began in the summer of 1990, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with a heavy, unyielding anger. The city had already decided the 5 boys were monsters. The prosecutors used that intense public rage as their main weapon, standing before the jury, pointing directly at the teenagers and confidently spinning a story of deliberate evil. Instead of presenting physical evidence, the state played the videotapes. They took the scared, confused words the boys had been forced to say after hours of abuse and twisted them into a master plan. The prosecutors painted a picture of a coordinated gang, completely ignoring the fact that the boys' stories did not match the crime scene or even each other. Watching these teenagers try to defend themselves against the massive power of the state was a profound sadness. They were just kids, sitting in oversized suits, looking incredibly small behind the wooden defense tables. When they tried to explain that they were only saying what the police told them to say, their voices barely carried across the intimidating room. They tried to tell the jury that they were scared, hungry, and that the detectives had promised they could go home if they just agreed to the story. But their desperate pleas were easily drowned out by powerful, experienced lawyers who knew exactly how to perform. The boys were fighting a machine built to crush them with no real weapons to fight back. The crushing end to the trials came with a sequence of words that would destroy 5 families forever. Guilty. Guilty, guilty. As the verdicts were read aloud, a heavy shock fell over the room, the raw sound of weeping mothers echoing off the courtroom walls. The safety they had been promised by the police was officially gone in that exact moment. The 5 boys realized they were not going home. Their childhoods were officially over, stolen by a jury that chose to believe a forced story over the absolute certainty of DNA science. They were branded as criminals for a brutal act they did not commit, their futures erased by the strike of a judge's gavel. While all 5 boys suffered an unimaginable loss, the path of one teenager stands out as a uniquely heartbreaking tragedy. Korey Wise was not even on the police radar that night in the park. He was not a suspect, and his name was not on any list of targets the detectives were looking for. Korey only walked into the police station because he wanted to support his friend Yusef Salaam, who had been asked to come in for questioning. Korey thought he was just being a good, loyal friend by tagging along to make sure Yusef was okay. That simple act of kindness turned him into the most tragic figure in the entire case. Once inside the station, the detectives quickly realized Korey was vulnerable and separated him from his friend. Korey was 16 years old and he struggled with hearing and learning difficulties, making him incredibly easy to confuse. The police isolated him in a small room, screamed in his face, and used physical intimidation to break his spirit. They kept him trapped without a parent or a lawyer, hammering him with lies until his mind completely shattered. They forced him to sign statements he could not even read properly, changing his story multiple times to try and make it fit the impossible facts of the crime. By the time they were done, the loyal friend had been transformed into a prime suspect. Because Korey was 16, the law demanded he be tried and punished as an adult. The pure terror of this reality is hard to put into words. A vulnerable boy who still slept in his childhood bed was suddenly ripped away from his family and thrown into the violent, unforgiving world of an adult maximum security prison. He was a child tossed into a cage with grown men, many of whom were hardened offenders. The justice system took a boy who just wanted to keep his friend company and handed him the ultimate brutal punishment. His loyalty cost him his freedom, his safety, and his mind, leaving him entirely alone in the dark. The reality of the prisons where the 5 boys were sent was dark, violent, and completely detached from the world they knew. Behind the massive walls of facilities like Rikers Island, the noise was a constant, deafening roar of slamming metal doors and angry shouts. The air smelled of sweat and bleach, a constant reminder that danger waited in every shadow. There was no peace to be found on the cold concrete floors. Every single day brought the immediate, very real threat of physical violence. They were innocent kids, raised in normal homes, who were suddenly forced to build up a tough, hardened armor just to survive the walk from their cells to the dining hall. As the years slowly dragged on, the boys faced another cruel trick designed by the justice system, known as the parole board. The rules of parole are simple but deeply unfair to the innocent. The system tells prisoners that if they stand up, admit they did the crime, and show remorse, they will be rewarded with an early release to go home. If you maintain your innocence, the board sees you as uncooperative and denies your freedom, keeping you locked in a cage. It takes immense, almost impossible strength to look at the people holding the keys to your cell and refuse to lie to them. The 5 boys chose to stay in prison longer, enduring more violence and lost time rather than admit to a crime they did not do. The cost of that lost time is measured in quiet, devastating losses that no amount of money or apologies can ever fix. While they sat in concrete boxes, they missed the simple milestones that define a normal life. They missed their high school graduations, they never went to their proms, and they had to mourn The deaths of family members from a cold telephone in a prison hallway. The profound tragedy is the time that can never be given back, lost to wrongful convictions. The quiet losses piled up. These boys were forced to grow into men inside concrete boxes, completely cut off from the world. They missed walking across a stage for high school graduations. They never put on suits for proms, and they never said goodbye to family members who passed away. Instead, they mourned loved ones through a cold telephone receiver in a prison hallway. This is the true cost of wrongful convictions. It is a theft of time that no amount of money can ever replace. While those innocent teenagers rotted in cells, a different reality unfolded outside. New York City believed it was safe. Trusting police had captured the people responsible for the brutal attack in the park, but the real monster was never caught. In 1989, the actual attacker walked the streets, completely free. The public locked their doors and felt secure, unaware a dangerous predator lived right alongside them. This false sense of safety masked a massive failure by authorities. By focusing all energy on breaking 5 innocent kids, investigators left the door wide open for the real criminal. The city's streets remained a hunting ground. The man who actually left the jogger near death was not hiding. He was blending in with the crowds, while the justice system patted itself on the back for a job well done. The name of that real attacker was Matias Reyes. He was a serial offender with a long history of violence, and he alone was responsible for the horrific crime. While police were busy forcing coerced confessions out of exhausted children, Reyes slipped right through their fingers. There was no physical evidence linking the boys to the scene because they were never there. The evidence belonged to Reyes. Because police were so focused on framing the teenagers, Reyes was left free to continue his violent path. In the months following the highly publicized arrests, he attacked other women in the city. The failure to catch him had tragic consequences for new victims. Police were too busy celebrating their famous victory to realize they had left a known predator on the streets. Eventually, the law did catch up with Matias Reyes, but for an entirely different crime. He was convicted of a separate murder and given a life sentence. He was placed in a dark, quiet cell in a maximum security prison in upstate New York. It was a cold, isolated place made of steel bars and thick concrete walls. Inside that bleak environment, Reyes sat in the shadows, far removed from the public eye. He was just another face in a crowded prison system, living out his days in a small gray room. But as he paced the hard floor of his cell, he held on to the darkest secret in the entire city. He knew exactly what had happened, and he knew who was to blame. For more than a decade, Reyes watched the news from behind bars. He saw the faces of the boys plastered on prison TV screens, branded as monsters by a society that hated them. He knew those 5 young men were losing their youth, enduring the daily violence of prison life, all because of his own actions. Yet, as the years ticked by, he kept his mouth shut. The silence of Matias Reyes reveals a cold, deeply disturbing apathy. He watched innocent kids grow up in cages and felt no need to speak up. He allowed them to carry the heavy weight of his own guilt. It takes a unique kind of darkness to watch someone else serve time for your crime and go to sleep every night without saying a single word. But the blame does not rest on Reyes alone. The justice system itself actively ignored any hints pointing away from their chosen suspects. Detectives and prosecutors had built their careers on this famous case. They were proud of their rapid arrests and high-profile courtroom wins. When details emerged that did not fit their story, they simply looked the other way. Unpacking this failure shows a massive flaw in how the law operates. The system became a machine that cared more about winning than finding the actual truth. Acknowledging that racial bias and rushed judgments had led to a huge mistake was simply not an option for the people in power. They refused to revisit the evidence, choosing to protect their own reputations rather than protect the innocent. As the late 1990s arrived, long before they were exonerated, 4 of the men finally finished their sentences. They packed their few belongings and walked out through the heavy steel gates, stepping back into New York City. But returning to the outside world did not mean they were free. They had survived the cages, but they stepped into a society that still firmly believed they were guilty. The world they returned to was harsh and unforgiving. People recognized their faces from newspapers and television broadcasts. They were still called monsters by strangers on the street. The label of a violent criminal clung to them like a shadow, making every simple task feel like an impossible battle. They had served their time, but the punishment continued every single day. The most painful part of their release was the permanent mark of the sex offender registry. Because of the nature of the false charges, they were forced to register their names and addresses with local police. This list became an invisible, suffocating prison that followed them everywhere. It ruined their chances of starting over and living a quiet, normal life. They were routinely denied jobs the moment employers ran a background check. They could not find apartments to rent because landlords refused to accept them. Every time they met someone new, they had to explain their presence on that list. Constantly forced to talk about a crime they did not commit. They were marked for life, trapped by a lie society refused to let go of. While 4 of the men tried to survive this cruel reality on the outside, the nightmare was far from over for the 5th. Korey Wise was still locked away in the darkest corner of the prison system. Because he was 16 at the time of his arrest, he had been tried as an adult and given a much longer sentence than his friends. Korey was left behind in the harsh, violent world of an adult maximum security facility. He was entirely alone, enduring daily physical and mental torment from other inmates and guards. While his friends were struggling to rebuild their lives in the city, Korey was just trying to survive the next 24 hours in a place designed to break a person down completely. Then, a shocking twist of fate occurred inside the New York prison system. Korey Wise was transferred to a new facility. By pure chance, this was the exact same prison where the real attacker, Matias Reyes, was serving his life sentence for murder. The universe had forcefully arranged for the innocent victim and the guilty predator to be locked inside the very same building. In 2002, the Department of Corrections transferred Korey Wise to Auburn Correctional Facility in upstate New York. He walked through the heavy steel doors, completely unaware that the man responsible for his destroyed youth was housed in the very same cell block. Matias Reyes was already there, serving a life sentence for brutal crimes committed after the 1989 attack. The state had blindly placed the victim of a massive legal failure just feet away from the true perpetrator. The prison yard at Auburn was a bleak concrete expanse where men paced under the constant watch of armed guards. High stone walls blocked out the horizon, trapping the noise of hundreds of inmates in a tight, echoing space. It was a harsh environment where weakness was punished, and survival meant keeping your head down. The air always felt heavy, thick with the tension of caged men. Across this crowded gray space, Matias Reyes spotted Korey Wise. They had crossed paths briefly years before on Rikers Island, an encounter that ended in a fight over a television. But now, seeing the man who had lost more than a decade of his life for a crime Reyes himself committed, the atmosphere shifted. The weight of an unspoken reality hung between them. Seeing Korey endure the daily brutality of maximum security broke something inside the real killer. Matias Reyes realized he could no longer carry the weight of what he had done in the park that night. He had watched innocent teenagers take the fall for his violence, and now he was watching one of them suffer right in front of his eyes. The secret finally became too heavy to hold. He made a decision that would alter legal history. Reyes approached the prison chaplain and wrote a formal letter to the authorities. In clear words, he confessed that he was the sole attacker of the jogger. He provided specific unreleased details about the crime scene that only the true perpetrator could know, offering to give up his own DNA to prove it. When the letter reached the original investigators, the reaction was not relief. Instead, the legal machinery immediately went on the defensive. The police department and the district attorney's office had built their reputations on these high-profile convictions. Admitting they had locked up 5 innocent boys meant admitting to a catastrophic failure. Rather than opening the prison doors, prosecutors launched a quiet campaign to discredit the confession. They interrogated Reyes, searching for any inconsistency to prove he was lying. The system fought desperately to protect its own narrative, proving it would rather maintain a flawed victory than face the ugly truth of its own mistakes. Inside their cells and out in the city, the men heard rumors of the confession. They had spent 13 years screaming their innocence to a world that refused to listen. Now the actual perpetrator had stepped forward, but they knew exactly how stubborn the state could be. They held their breath, deeply afraid that this miracle would be swept under the rug. The fear was paralyzing. They had survived the worst the justice system could throw at them, but the thought of having the truth so close, only to have it snatched away again, was agonizing. Every passing day without news felt like another sentence. They worried they would remain marked as monsters, their names forever tied to a crime they never committed. But the physical evidence could no longer be ignored. Deep in the property clerk's office, the rape kit from 1989 had been sitting in a cardboard box for over a decade. Investigators retrieved the preserved samples and sent them to a modern laboratory. The technology had advanced significantly, and this time they were looking for a specific match. The lab technicians extracted the genetic material and ran it against the sample provided by Matias Reyes. The results came back with absolute mathematical certainty. It was a perfect match. The science confirmed exactly what the boys had tried to tell the detectives during those grueling interrogations 13 years earlier. There was no room for debate. With that single scientific report, the entire foundation of the state's case collapsed. The aggressive interrogations, the contradictory timelines, and the public outrage had all been built on a devastating lie. The undeniable proof shattered the illusion that law enforcement had solved the crime. The house of cards fell, exposing a massive fiction that ruined 5 lives. The realization hit the city like a physical blow. The coerced statements that the jury had trusted were exposed as pure fabrication, forced out of exhausted, frightened children. The racial bias that had fueled the rush to judgment was now laid bare for the world to see. The authorities had to face the undeniable fact that their blind pursuit of a conviction had allowed the real predator to remain free to strike again. The newspapers and television stations that had once called for their execution were suddenly forced to change their headlines. The narrative shifted from a story of feral youth to a story of a broken justice system. The men were no longer the villains of a city's darkest night. The public began to see them not as perpetrators, but as the ultimate victims of a system gone wrong. Their old label was stripped away, replaced by a new title that acknowledged their innocence and their endurance. They were born again in the public eye as the Exonerated Five. The name served as a permanent reminder of their wrongful convictions and the state's failure. It was a hard-won victory, but one that came at an unimaginable cost. In the summer of 2002, the heavy steel gates of the maximum security prison finally opened for Korey Wise. He stepped out into the sunlight, squinting against the brightness of a world he had not seen freely in more than a decade. The sheer relief washed over him, mixed with a deep, aching sorrow. He was finally going home. But the boy who had walked into the precinct just to support his friend was gone forever. Korey had entered the system as a frightened 16-year-old child and was now walking out as a 30-year-old man. He embraced his mother, tears streaming down his face, mourning the youth, the experiences, and the simple joys that had been brutally stolen from him. Unpacking this tragedy forced the entire country to confront a dangerous reality about the justice system. People finally had to accept that under the right pressure, innocent individuals really do sign false confessions. The case proved that intense police mind games, isolation, and deceit are deadly weapons. They are psychological tools powerful enough to break anyone, regardless of their innocence. The nation was forced to look at a dark truth. Every day, people had to realize that under the right kind of pressure, anyone could be pushed to say they did something terrible, even if they were completely innocent. The tactics used in those small, closed rooms were exposed not as a search for the truth, but as a trap. It became clear that when adults use isolation, fear, and endless lies against exhausted teenagers, the resulting words are meaningless. This realization shook the very foundation of how people viewed police questioning. In December of 2002, a crowded courtroom in Manhattan became the stage for a long overdue correction. The 5 men, no longer the scared boys who had been marched in front of cameras a decade earlier, stood before a judge. The district attorney's office, faced with the undeniable proof of DNA and a matching confession from the real attacker, officially asked the court to throw out all the convictions. It was a formal legal process, stripping away the mountain of false evidence that had buried them. The judge struck the gavel, and the heavy, crushing weight of the guilty verdicts was legally erased from the record. In the eyes of the law, the men were finally cleared of the terrible crime in the park. It was a massive, historic moment of justice, captured by reporters and celebrated by supporters who had fought for them for years. But the sound of that gavel could not turn back the clock, delivering a clean slate 13 years too late to save their stolen youth. Even as the legal system cleared their names, a bitter reality remained. The detectives and prosecutors who had built the false case stubbornly refused to apologize. Instead of looking inward at the massive damage they had caused, they clung tightly to bizarre, impossible theories to justify their actions. They suggested, without a single piece of evidence, that the boys must have somehow worked together with the real attacker, desperately trying to keep the old broken story alive. This refusal to admit fault revealed a stunning arrogance. The people who held the power to lock away children simply would not face the darkness of their own mistakes. They had ruined 5 lives, ripped families apart, and allowed a dangerous criminal to remain free to hurt others, yet they offered no remorse. For the men who had just been cleared, this lack of an apology was a final, cruel insult from a system that still saw them as the enemy. On paper, the Exonerated Five were completely free, but the world they lived in was still shaped by the trauma of their past. The physical bars of the prison had been replaced by invisible cages built from memories they could not escape. Nightmares routinely shattered their sleep, pulling them back to the cold concrete floors and the constant buzzing tension of the cell block. The sudden slam of a door or the sight of a police uniform on the street could trigger a wave of panic, a physical reminder of the powerlessness they had endured. They walked through their neighborhoods carrying a heavy, unseen burden. The simple act of going to a store or looking for a job was colored by the fear that someone might still recognize their faces from the old hateful newspaper covers. The deep psychological wounds from the coerced confessions and the years of wrongful convictions did not vanish with a judge's order. They lived in an environment where true safety felt like an illusion, constantly looking over their shoulders in a world that had once tried to swallow them whole. Watching this tragedy unfold completely broke the heart of the public. Communities, especially black and brown neighborhoods, felt a deep, cold confirmation of their worst fears. If 5 innocent kids could be pulled from the streets, systematically broken in an interrogation room, and locked away for a decade, then no one was truly safe. The absolute trust in the badge, the belief that this system was built to find the truth, was shattered beyond repair. It was a heavy and painful realization that the very people sworn to protect the community possessed the power to destroy it without consequence. Parents looked at their own children and wondered how they could ever keep them safe from a system that could so easily manufacture a monster out of a frightened boy. The case left behind a bitter, lingering doubt, a permanent crack in the foundation of justice that made people question every arrest and every headline. That deep distrust was also aimed at the news media, which had acted as a powerful weapon in the destruction of the 5 boys. Newspapers and TV stations did not just report the facts. They fueled a massive fire of public anger. They took the police reports as absolute truth and splashed the faces of the teenagers across front pages, using language that stripped away their humanity. The media acted as both judge and jury, convicting the boys in the court of public opinion long before a real trial ever began. This case exposed the destructive power of a bad headline. It showed how racial bias could be packaged into daily news stories, teaching the public to fear and hate these specific children. When reporters repeated the words of the police without question, they helped build the prison walls around the boys. It became a clear, dark lesson in how easily the press can be used by the state to crush innocent lives, turning a city against its own youth in a matter of days. Determined to hold the system accountable, the 5 men filed a massive civil lawsuit against New York City. They accused the police and the prosecutors of malicious prosecution, racial discrimination, and emotional distress. This was not a quick or easy fight. The city pushed back with incredible force, refusing to settle the case or admit any wrongdoing. For over a decade, lawyers for the city fought the men at every single turn, dragging them through endless legal meetings and painful depositions. The men were forced to sit across from lawyers and answer brutal, invasive questions about their trauma over and over again. The city spent millions of dollars trying to defend the actions of the police, desperately trying to avoid paying for the massive mistakes that had been made. It was a grueling, exhausting marathon of legal paperwork and courtroom battles. The men had to prove their pain to a government that still seemed determined to break them down, turning their fight for justice into a second, agonizing trial. Finally, in 2014, a new city administration agreed to end the bitter fight. New York City announced a settlement of $41 million to be divided among the 5 men. It was roughly $1 million for every single year they had spent locked inside a prison cell. On the surface, the massive number sounded like a historic victory, a final public validation that the city had deeply wronged them. It was a financial punishment meant to balance the scales of justice, But behind the large settlement was a deep, unshakable sadness. No amount of money printed on a check could ever buy back a missed high school prom, a lost first love, or the quiet safety of a childhood bedroom. The millions could not erase the memory of crying alone on a concrete floor, or bring back the family members who had died of a broken heart while they were locked away. The money was a necessary admission of guilt from the city, but it was a cold trade for the lives they were never allowed to live. Instead of taking the settlement and disappearing into the quiet lives they had always wanted, the men chose a different path. They refused to let the story end with a check. They took the deep, lasting pain of their experience and forged it into a powerful tool. The men stepped back into the public eye, not as the scared suspects the city had created, but as fierce advocates for change. They transformed their tragedy into a weapon to fight the very system that had tried to bury them. They began traveling across the country, standing on stages and sitting in legislative halls, demanding that the rules of justice be rewritten. They used their names and their faces to force politicians to look at the human cost of a broken system. The 5 men evolved from the victims of a terrible lie into relentless warriors for the truth. As they traveled, they became the loud, clear voices for the thousands of people who had been forgotten. They spoke for the men and women still trapped in cells, screaming their innocence to walls that would not listen, for anyone who had ever been crushed by the massive weight of a wrongful conviction. The sight of these 5 men standing tall was the ultimate symbol of hope. As these men traveled, they became the ultimate symbol of survival for anyone crushed by a wrongful conviction. They spoke directly for the forgotten people locked away. Their presence proved that truth could break through the darkest walls. Their tragedy forced lawmakers to look closely at how police operate behind closed doors. Advocates began pushing hard for new rules to mandate the recording of police interrogations. The goal was vital: turn on a camera and leave it running. Unpacking the details of these new rules reveals a direct strike against police deception. When a camera records every single second, detectives cannot easily hide their aggressive tactics. The lens captures the threats, the exhaustion, and the exact moments a frightened suspect breaks down. The fight did not stop at adding video cameras. A legal push began to pass laws making it strictly illegal for police to lie to children during questioning. This targeted the exact deceptive methods that ruined 5 young lives decades ago. These new laws aim to ensure no teenager is ever tricked into a false confession again. By removing the ability of a detective to invent fake evidence, the system protects vulnerable minds from immense pressure. The world finally saw the stark reality of their ordeal when modern documentaries and major TV series broadcast their story. Screens across the globe lit up with the facts buried in the late 80s, placing viewers directly into the harsh reality those boys faced. This cultural shift transformed a hostile environment into one of deep empathy. The men were finally given the loud, clear voice the city had violently denied them. People who had once believed the lies now watched the true events unfold before their eyes. Through all the public speaking and screen adaptations, the most powerful outcome remains the unbreakable bond between the 5 men. Before that night in the park, they were mostly strangers. The shared trauma of being hunted and caged forged them into permanent brothers. It is a beautiful yet heartbreaking reality that they share a unique isolation. Out of billions of people, they are the only 5 who truly understand the exact nightmare they survived. They lean on each other to bear the weight of their stolen years. Their story serves as a stark warning about the extreme fragility of the truth. It shows how easily hard facts and clear science can be completely buried under a mountain of fear and racial bias. When a city panics, evidence is often discarded. It is a harsh reminder that the truth only matters if people in power are willing to listen. The police had the facts, but chose to ignore them to maintain their narrative. Justice requires an audience willing to hear it. Perhaps the hardest thought to accept is that the Exonerated Five are just the famous ones. Their names are known, but they represent a much larger, quieter tragedy. Across the country, an unknown number of innocent people are sitting in dark cells right now. These forgotten ghosts of the justice system remain locked away simply because they were scared into signing a paper. They do not have a famous documentary to bring their plight to light. They are the hidden victims of coerced confessions, waiting for truth. The entire disaster highlights the extreme danger of a public mob. When a society demands blood and quick answers to a terrible crime, the system almost always grabs the wrong person. The rush to find a villain blinds everyone to the actual facts. In these moments of mass panic, the real danger is not just the criminal, it is what ordinary people become when blinded by fear and anger. A frightened society will easily throw away its own rules, sacrificing innocent children just to feel safe. The timeline of their wrongful convictions provides a clear recipe for disaster. It starts with biased police officers and screaming detectives who decide on a suspect before looking at clues. It accelerates when a hungry media prints rumors as facts, creating instant villains. The final ingredient is a public that completely refuses to ask questions. When the community accepts the police narrative without demanding proof, the machine breaks down entirely. The real perpetrator, Matias Reyes, is left free to roam while innocent kids take the fall. Despite their freedom today, the deep personal cost of this systemic failure remains heavy. On May 12, 2020, Yusef Salaam spoke openly about how the ghosts of those cold interrogation rooms still visit him. The permanent damage of a lie forever echoes in their lives. The scars of those forced confessions did not vanish when the prison doors opened. Korey Wise, who spent over 12 years locked away, has spoken about the heavy moments when memories of those harsh police tactics flood back. They can smile and accept awards today, but the trauma of being a terrified teenager trapped in a small room never completely washes away. The damage of a coerced lie is a lifelong sentence. If you walk through Central Park today, the paths are quiet. Families spread blankets on the green grass, and joggers pass by without a second thought. It looks like a peaceful escape, but the soil here carries the heavy stain of 1989, a permanent reminder of the night the city demanded blood from innocent boys. The fallout from that night eventually forced the legal system to look in the mirror. States across the country began passing laws requiring police to record every single minute of a juvenile interrogation on video. Lawmakers realized a closed door and a desperate detective were a recipe for false guilt. By turning on the cameras from the first question, the courts created a firm barrier against the pressure that broke those teenagers. Yet the human cost of waiting decades for that rule to change is staggering. Parents passed away while their sons sat in metal cages, punished for a crime they did not commit. Entire neighborhoods learned to view the badge not as a shield, but as a threat that could snatch away a child at any moment. That deep break in community trust remains a raw nerve today. The exoneration sent a shockwave through the public, forcing a hard look at the racial bias baked into the justice system. When the city agreed to a $41 million settlement in 2014, it was an admission of total failure. It forced people to accept a painful reality. The courts were not always blind, and a signed paper was not always the truth, especially when the person holding the pen was an exhausted child. Even with the real attacker, Matias Reyes, behind bars and the truth finally on the record, a difficult question hangs in the air. How do we completely remove the deep prejudice that still walks into the interrogation room? The laws have changed, but the human flaws that led to the rush to judgment are much harder to erase. In response to the disaster, police departments were forced to overhaul how they handle witness statements. Detectives are now trained to avoid leading questions that feed specific crime scene details to a suspect. The goal is to ensure that any confession contains facts only the true guilty party would know. It is a strict procedural wall built from the rubble of the Central Park investigation. For legal advocates working today, the case serves as the ultimate warning sign. It is taught in law schools as the prime example of how quickly the pursuit of justice can warp into a blind hunt for a scapegoat. Every time a new lawyer reads the transcripts of those forced statements, they see the exact blueprint of how an innocent life is stolen. It stands as a permanent lesson that a fast conviction is often a false one. The exoneration shattered a long-held public assumption that a signed statement was an absolute guarantee of guilt. For decades, juries were told that no innocent person would ever admit to a violent act they did not commit. The realization that 5 teenagers were broken down until they lied against themselves removed that safety net entirely. Trust in the badge was fractured, replaced by a lingering caution that still dictates how parents teach their children to speak to law enforcement today. Yet, despite the DNA evidence and the financial settlements, a heavy question remains permanently unanswered. If investigators could so easily secure 5 false statements in such a highly scrutinized case, how many unknown inmates are currently sitting in prison cells right now? There is no central database that can count the exact number of forced admissions hidden within decades of closed files. The legal system relies on finality, leaving an unmeasured void where the true scale of wrongful imprisonment may never be fully known. Today, the most durable consequence of their stolen years is found mounted in the upper corners of precinct interview rooms. Small, blinking camera lenses now record the entire process of questioning from the moment a suspect sits at the metal table. Beyond the lenses, the very laws governing how police talk to children have slowly transformed across the country. New statutes now forbid detectives from lying to juvenile suspects, a direct response to the false promises made to 5 scared teenagers decades ago. In the quiet stretches of the northern woods, the dirt paths remain unchanged. Yet they serve as a permanent reminder of the night 5 boys walked into the trees and the decades it took for them to finally step back into the light.